got to thinking about this verse, and I, was spending some time praying on it, meditating on it, I first asked myself, the question, why are we hated? So what do you think, not just in modern day, but in just the theological underlying purpose, why do you think most people have sort of this rift between the church and the world?
Lack of understanding.
Yeah. Got butterfingers this morning. Definitely lack of understanding.
Mistreatment at the church.
Yeah. And I'll go through one at a time. Because I grew up in this area, obviously it's very church-centered and very church-cultured. Even if you aren't necessarily a part of the church, you have a good grasp and understanding of, at least around here, because it is a small community, church starts at this time, and generally this is the outline, even if you are from a different denomination. I recently, because Marshall has this influx of new people moving in, I've gotten to know some people from the community that's coming in, and I have gotten the opportunity to just have a general conversation with them about the culture of the church around here and the influence it has. And there were so many things that I didn't realize, growing up in this culture, that I didn't know was common language, So it's been very interesting. So, and then, which also plays into the mystery of it. To a degree, because we are different than the world, people feel like it's almost a secret for some reason, and that we're all in on this secret together. But maybe it's just my understanding of it. Does anybody else? Is there anyone in your life who's not involved in the church that sort of has this curiosity?
Well, y'all know I'm a preacher. Neither of my sons are involved in the church.
Yeah.
Although both of them in their way are very focused on or very faithful. It's interesting to me that the early Christians, in relation to the early followers of Jesus after he had died and been resurrected, were accused of being atheists by the surrounding culture. The reason for that was that they did not embrace the polytheistic culture, which even included the ruler of the area, or the ruler of the known world, Caesar, as a god. They didn't take their signals from the culture or the political culture of the day, and so they were accused of being atheists. My sons have a different view. They see the dominant church as being subsumed in and by the culture, and not counterculture. Gaming has been no for dominant in this region church. Women's productive rights, no in the dominant church of this area, and so forth.
Women preaching.
Ignoring of the rights and needs of the poor, except by giving stuff. But to change the culture in line with Jesus.
What did you say, Keith?
Just as simple as women preaching.
So, I think there's a difference in the reason why people hate the dominant Protestant conservative church that they believe represents the church in this area. Different from what it was in the Roman world. Just personal observation, no scientific.
Well, that's a nice transition, because that's exactly what I was going to talk about. I was going to sort of break down this idea of why, this is going to sound bad, but follow me, why we should be hated and why we are hated. And I say hated as just the term because of the verse how it says they hated me and so they will hate you. And as Wiley was talking about, the modern church is hated by the main culture because when I say church, I'm not talking about, our church. I'm talking about just the church, all the denominations mushed together. It's very hard to find churches that, as my grandmother says, walk the walk and talk the talk. Because we, as a society, have become what I call the trail mix church. We pick out the M&Ms, the stuff we like, and we leave all the nutritious stuff and the stuff that's not necessarily our favorite in the bowl. And why I think the church, quote unquote, should be hated, or the main culture having animosity towards us, is because of the way that we love. When I say love, it's a big, over-encompassing thing, so just follow me here. And this is one of my favorite verses, and this verse really was one of those pivoting points in my young life when I was like 15 or 16 on how I viewed Christ's love for us. Because I grew up, for those of you who don't know, I grew up in a Hellfire Brimstone Baptist church. Like, if the preacher wasn't sweating through his shirt, he didn't have a successful service. Like, that is... But this really changed it for me, and it's John 15, verse 12. This is my commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. No love is greater than this, to lay down his life for his friends. And obviously, as I got older and I went to college, I realized that not only does this count as a physical thing, being able, it doesn't always mean jumping in front of a bullet for your friends. It means laying down your life in a metaphorical sense. And to me, that means laying down selfishness. I'm really bad. And I would like to think we're all a little bit bad, so I'm not alone on that raft. That, sometimes, and you do have to take care of yourself, but sometimes you're like, I don't want to go help. Do you know anybody who gets excited about helping their friends move? Nobody. But, we have to put that aside sometimes. So, laying down selfishness. And forgive my southpaw left-handed slander. If you can't read it, volunteer for scribe.
I want to go back just a minute.
Yeah.
Never felt hated because I was part of the church.
Well, hated is a strong word, and it's only the word I've been using because that's how the verse uses it. If the world hates you, understand that it hated me first. I do think animosity, especially in this current climate, is a better their word or there's tension. Like I said, a lot of my friends, there's oddly enough a group of people moving in from New York into Marshall, and I'm like, did you throw a dart at a map? But,
Yes, they did.
well, the big response I've gotten is Asheville's too expensive, here we are. But, you know, when they find out I'm a Christian, I instantly see their shoulders get a little tense and they're waiting for some sort of homophobic slur or racist slur or some sort of prejudice.
Or a preaching.
Yes. Especially when I pull out, I'm a female minister, I see, you know. And oddly enough, you know, I've told them, I'm like, yeah, I get a little bit of pushback in this community because I am a female minister. They're like, really, that's what we're going to get upset about? But, where was I going with that? Y'all can't put me on a tangent like that. Oh, yes, but there's just like this tension because they're trying to test the water as to where I'm at. And so just because I am young in a lot of the culture that I'm in, I'm like, I go to an LGBTQIA affirming church that is female pastor led, and we're part of the Racial Justice Coalition. And instantly they just like, they're like, okay, we're good. But sadly, we do live in a world where I have to present this list of credentials so people don't know that I'm about to burn them at the stake, metaphorically. But I think also, let's see, where was I going with that? Oh, yes. I promise, guys, I'm getting there. I'm on 1 cup of coffee. So laying down selfishness. What else is something we have to lay down in order to love as Christ did, or Christ does?
Acceptance.
You know, we have to lay down bias, which and I'm not going to lie, especially growing up in this area, and I don't know about you guys or how your families operated, with this influx of people coming in, I got a little nervous at first because I was so used to Madison County culture, and I was very nervous that they would come in and it would be changed. But what's really great about this group of people that I've gotten to know is the parts that I love about the culture are the parts that they're trying to preserve. Like, most of them are canning for the first time in their lives, which has been a fun, they call me like I know something about it for some reason. They're like canning and growing small farms and raising chickens. And, you know, they're learning how to quilt and preserving this mountain heritage craftsmanship that I absolutely adore. And like, they're like, oh, we love like, you know, music like Dolly Parton, and they're really getting the bluegrass. And the parts that I love about this community are still getting preserved, but they're also trying to show the community like racial acceptance and bringing in the LGBTQIA community. And it's really great getting to see this community grow back into the things I loved about it and the things that, you know, I was hoping to hang on to. Like some of my friends who are from New York, I'm taking them horseback riding for the first time. That's going to be a fun experience, I feel. But laying down different bias, and I think it's really amazing that we have the internet, because we are learning so much, because so much information is being shown light, especially growing up in this area that I think the last statistic I saw was 98.7% predominantly white. I didn't know microaggressions were a thing. I didn't know that there was still a lot of cultural bias, and I'm getting to learn that and grow and make sure and educate others and learning myself. So I think it's really amazing the tools and resources that we now have to be able to learn and grow as people and laying down those biases, because sometimes if you don't know that that stuff is out there, obviously you can't learn about it, you know?
Well, up until recently, and I'm not, others may know how recently, Madison County was considered a sundown community. And I had to look up that term when I heard that, a sundown community, which is, and again, I had never heard of this. I had to look it up to better understand it, but it is a community where BIPOC populations, people who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, are essentially considered unsafe once the sun goes down. It's encouraged that they not be out and that they are at home or at a safe place literally once the sun goes down, because of racial bias in that community. Now, it's my understanding and there's a nonprofit organization that lists sundown communities across many states. Madison County is no longer listed. However, there are counties contiguous to us, if I'm not mistaken. Yancey County is still considered a sundown community, as is Mitchell County. And so when you think about our college student population, or even people moving from that area, the church's role in standing up and speaking out against racism, or even I think to add to that list with love, it's being willing to break the rules or being willing to break barriers, and or getting comfortable with being uncomfortable.
How much of that do you think has to do with the fact that there's a university here with a lot of diversity in that?
I think that's helped. I think that's one of the biggest things that has helped here over time. However, I have also heard from the police chief that basically, if you are out after like 10 p.m., they're probably going to pull you over just to see what you're up to, because they have a feeling that there's not much around here that would mean you are up to no good, no matter who you are. But for a person of color who may not be familiar with this, and then it's it being the Marshall Police Department, it's most likely going to be a white officer and what feeling of uncomfort. But I do, to your point, Margaret, I do think the university has helped tremendously in that, and also people's understanding. But then if we also look, there is a, it's not a very large Black community here, but there's a decently sized Black community in Mars Hill. But if you think about where you see them, most likely you don't see them in England, at least not the Mars Hill. And to think about that, and to think about why that may be, is it that they don't feel comfortable there? Is it that they don't feel that there are others like them there? And what I've heard from members, and he will be preaching coming up in a couple of weeks, Jonathan McCoy, who's the director of diversity and inclusion at Mars Hill University. I think he's preaching 3 weeks from today, or 2 weeks from today. But he said they go to Leaderville, because largely they still may not even feel comfortable or as part of this community. And I think we have to think about, in some ways, what is our role. I know this church supported the fish fry this summer on July 4th, and then we've also supported the pulpit exchange. And I think things like that continue to further that cause. But it may also be thinking about, are there things that we can do for the students on campus, or athletic events that we can support as well?
You know, the minister at the Black church here talked to some of us once about the harassment that he received in Asheville when he was coming back from a religious musical presentation late at night, you know, and how he was pulled over and accused of having stolen the musical instruments in his car, and all sorts of harassment that he received being on the road late at night that he was related to. I don't know how many years ago that was.
Yes, Ms. Kramer?
When Bob and I moved here in 1965, the KKK was very active here.
Yes.
Very, very active. And a very close friend of mine's sister had a child by a Black man. She was in the service and had to be deployed elsewhere for a while, and my friend and her husband offered to keep the child with them safe, while her sister was away. And they burned a cross in her yard. And there was a man who I really respected. He was the father of a teacher in my school and lived in the Upper Laurel community, and he made shovel handles for people. He was just a good man, I thought. He was the Grand Dragon. I found out 20 years later, and I thought, I was just shocked. I was just really shocked. But it was very active here in the late 60s and early 70s.
And do you know why that is?
No.
Zebulon Vance, who you guys may know, his historical home, he was one of our governors. He brought the KKK into North Carolina. He was the grand wizard for the state.
He had a lot of members too.
Yes.
Well,
And hold him accountable for all of it.
Oh, I know. I'm just saying. Think about it. One town over, starting point. Here we are.
actually, beginning back in the 30s, which was a big thing for the Klan. From that point on, North Carolina, which as a South Carolinian I saw and still do as a relatively progressive state, was the key home of the Ku Klux Klan. And the reason was precisely that the government, and by the 60s, the government was progressive, and the governing forces did not, as for example in Alabama, support segregation and so forth. Here they saw the Klan as necessary. In Alabama, it was not as strong because they saw the government as representing them.
Same in Mississippi. The same in Mississippi.
Same in Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
So
I never saw
it's
Klans,
almost,
down
remember
there.
that old saying, be glad for who hates you. You know who you are by who hates you. But it's not that North Carolina was a whole bunch of racists as a state. It was precisely that the racism was challenged in North Carolina, and therefore the Klan became strong.
And the Klan also took care of men who were beating their wives, white people.
Yes.
I think to some extent that love is recognizing things like racism that we may not be able to point directly to a verse in the Bible or a commandment or something of that nature directly that says racism is a sin. However, we can point to texts that support the fact that racism is a sin and that Jesus would have stood up against racism. And I think recognizing racism as a sin, but then also recognizing that it's not good enough just to not be racist, that you have to go one step further and be anti-racist and stand up and speak out when other people may say something or may do something that isn't in line with that, and being willing to testify to the fact that racism very much is a sin, and it is a continued sin, particularly in communities in this area.
Yes. Which brings me to this thought, the story of the Samaritan woman.
Yes.
At the well. And, I don't know how much you know about the geography of this period, but Samaria was like enemy number one to the people of Jerusalem and Israel. And the disciples were like, "You're speaking with a Samaritan woman? How dare you?" And Jesus said, in essence, this is obviously loose paraphrase, but she is also loved by God. He went out of his way to speak to someone who's considered, oppressed, or who is oppressed, especially in the eyes of Israel, and considered a second-class citizen. And not only a second-class citizen for being a Samaritan person, but also being a woman.
Yes.
And, if you are not directly related in the sense of mother, daughter, or sister, you usually didn't speak to a woman. So not only did Jesus break cultural barriers, but he broke the social norm of speaking to a woman who he was not related to or pursuing romantically.
Something I wanted to address with what he said. We are so in a little cocoon here. I don't, number one, if I go to the grocery store, I don't see any blacks in the grocery store. I don't see any Asians in the grocery store. So the opportunity to defend what I think anyone would say to me is just not there. You just don't have those opportunities because we're in such a little insulated area that it makes it difficult to be able to speak out. And the times that I have been in a situation where I have heard something that I really found offensive, it was not the time and the place to say anything. It could have been with a large group of people or something like that. So I think that we'll have to get out of this little cocoon area in order to be able to have a voice and to do anything. And so it does make it difficult, but it is nice that you see people coming in from other cultures and think that they're going to be assimilated into this area by canning and quilting and all this stuff. That's not what it takes to become part of this community.
Yeah.
It can help, but just like for me, for me to be able to feel like I was becoming part of this community, I came to this church.
Yeah.
So it depends on what you're looking for as far as what you think is important to the area and that you're moving into.
To pick up on both of your points. First, there's an amazing discovery that has just been available to even biblical scholars, because a bunch of papyri, have been held very closely by a group of German scholars for a long time, and even other scholars were not allowed to see them. This, I'm pointing to Jesus' understanding of women, which was totally counterculture. You remember the story of Mary and Martha in Luke? Mm-hmm. Well, there's also a story of Mary, parenthesis, and Martha with a big question mark in John. What this papyrus, which is very old, revealed, that a monk that was, the only way you could reproduce was to write. A monk deliberately, evidently, mistranslated the word that is printed as Martha in John. It was not, in the papyrus, it was not Martha. It's a word that means the tower. Mary the tower. And it's opened up a whole, this was discovered of all things by a Harvard graduate student, woman. It's opened up a whole new understanding of what was happening in the early church. You had Peter the Rock was the leader of one faction of disciples, of Jesus' followers after Jesus' death and resurrection. And Mary the tower, Mary Magdalene, think about this now. Mary Magdalene was the leader of another group of Jesus' followers. Later, the dominant church kind of erased that. But Jesus' understanding of women was absolutely radical when you look at how he acted instead of how even his disciples and the early gospel writers reported it when they got a chance. Women were prominent among Jesus' disciples, but not listed among the male 12 by the people who were recording. So this is, to your point, I'll say one more thing and I'll promise to shut up for the rest of the time.
Oh, be free, butterfly.
I was amused the other day, a couple of months ago, to find that there is a retired Baptist preacher across the street in the Mars Hill Manor who refers to this church as, quote now, quote, the queer church.
Oh, that's a common identifier in the community.
Okay? Now,
He's a retired minister.
he's retired, he is old, he sits on the front porch and talks with everybody. And this is a bad part, and I haven't had a chance to correct him on this, but I will. Both of these could be compliments, depending on how we look at it. Refers to our pastor as the lesbian pastor, which he is definitely not, despite the fact that we probably would be very happy with that. But anyway, we have a unique, almost, witness that is critical in this environment that we are living in as a congregation. We are not a, quote, queer church in the sense that we don't exist only for gays, lesbians, transgendered, and our members are not primarily gays, lesbians. But we embrace Jesus' understanding of the gospel. So, be proud of those who hate you.
It used to be the Episcopal Church had that label because they had many members who were lesbians and homosexuals, and I thought, well, that's a great thing. You know, they were inclusive way back. And a lot of the people who were members in that founding church were members here before they went to that church. But that's, it could be a compliment.
The interesting thing is that more people from over there now attend this congregation
Right.
than were when he started talking.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
there you go, there you go. But he sees our signs out front too,
Oh,
down
yes.
by the roads, so,
Which this is a side thought to the main thought. Obviously, there are some people that you can argue till you're blue in the face.
Arguing doesn't help.
Yeah, no, or it's arguing for them. For me, it's a discussion. You know how that is sometimes. But I finally had to just boil down to the point. I'm like, if accepting someone for who they are is the worst thing I do, I think God's going to be okay with it. So.
I keep reminding and listening to this conversation about our move to Shelby Laurel. I forgot how many years it is, more than a decade now, our part-time move. And we were the outsiders. But we have loved them and they have loved us fully in return. I never felt anything but welcome and I love you. And I think it begins with our own hearts and how we greet people, how we meet them. That's the first thing.
And like Wally going across to the retirement center and sitting down with that guy and talking.
I can't understand you because of the mask. I'm sorry.
But with Wally going across the street and sitting down and visiting with this minister and letting him know he's a minister too, that's a way of accepting him. And, you know, that made Tim tone him down a bit to know that there are other ministers who think differently.
Well, just what I plan to do and have been preventing for several weeks from doing, but I haven't seen him out, is to go and sit down and say, I understand that you're a minister, and let him talk for 15 minutes. And then say, you sound very serious about your faith, and I'm glad of that. And I know that you would not want to bear false witness. Probably accidentally, you have been saying some things, passing on some things that are simply not true, especially that our pastor, yes, she is a woman, we believe in women's ministry, but she is not a lesbian, even though that would be really fine with us. And you don't need to be spreading that. But I want to listen for a good while first. And then talk with him about what he means when he says this is a queer church. And try to develop some, not change his mind, I know better, but to develop at least an understanding. If he's going to criticize us for who we are.
And he needs to come over and visit.
Yeah,
He
he has
see
been
what it's
invited.
like.
He has been invited by one of our members to come over and visit.
Good.
So in love, we are laying down selfishness, we are laying down bias, we are laying down social norms. I think also we have to lay down comfortability. We have to lay down comfort. Like Wiley was talking about, there are some conversations that are super hard that need to be had. Besides my degree in theology, I have 2 undergraduate degrees. One is in communications. And I got those because I love Jesus and I talk a lot. So I thought I'd get some paper, solidifying that. But even being taught, like, quote unquote, the art of conversation, it's still really hard for me to have those conversations with people and to have conversations where I'm not that I'm trying to change someone's mind, but I'm trying to show someone a new perspective. For me, I think that's really what shifted how I conversate with people, have conversations with people, is just being able to open up a new thought process. You know what I mean? I used to And I'm sure you know how the Baptist model of conversion, I call it, you go up to a complete stranger and say, do you know Jesus? Like, I don't know why we think that's the best model, but it is really hard to have those conversations with people, and especially people that have different opinions than you within the same circle, if that makes sense. On every time my father's family gets together, I am the snowflake of the bunch. And it can be hard to love someone when they have a different opinion than you, especially if it's a drastically different opinion than you. But I also have to remember that Christ created them and Christ loves them the same way he loves me. And I think once we start coming from that place of love and not just trying to change opinions is when it starts becoming true, because there are some people that want to be right for the sake of being right, and there are some people who want to open a dialogue.
I think one of the important points that Wally made was he starts conversation by listening.
Yeah.
And I think that's where so often we become defensive or we want to state our opinion, and I think we forget how important it is to listen first and to not be judgmental and to not be defensive about our own beliefs.
Yeah. My mom's side of the family, for any of you that know Miss Kramer knows, we all talk on top of each other. I think I was 15 before I got like a full sentence out in a family conversation. That's just how we are. We're like a big, loud Scottish family. But my mom finally told me one day, she's like, you need to learn to listen for the sake of listening and not listen for the sake of replying. And that was some life-changing advice. Because I realized that in my head I was crafting some sort of reply on the way to my next point instead of listening to what they had to say. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of people, their opinions are shaped by their worldview. And if you've not had a different worldview in your worldview, then there's, you were like little iron fortress, like the medieval kingdoms that have this big wall around it, because you haven't been exposed to anything else. And it can be scary. It's like trying a food that they won't tell you what's in it, They're just like, here's the plate, and you're like, what's in it? And they're like, you can figure that out. But love is just realizing, I think, that we are all created in Christ and that we are not meant to be served, but to serve. And sometimes that means doing it with humility, which is a fun little lesson I'm learning in my young adult years. I go back to the idea of when Jesus washes the disciples' feet. And for me, I love to paint a full picture, and that's how I really get immersed in the Bible. I don't know if you guys growing up, I grew up barefoot. Obviously, I had shoes, but like walking around my grandmother's house, she would walk around barefoot, and I wanted to be just like her. So we would be out in the yard, planting flowers, pulling weeds together, or like out in the horse pasture together, just hanging out barefoot. And, she would always tell me to hose off my feet before I went back in the house, which obviously we have a water hose, but think about the intimacy of being in somebody's dirty, mucky foot space, and like the humility that brings in it. You're looking up at them. They are being served. And which is not always the greatest feeling to serve, but imagine someone who has never been served being served for the first time. Like, for example, some of my new friends that are in the area, I brought them a housewarming gift because they moved into their first home, and they were surprised. No one had ever done that for them. And to see the joy on someone's face when you do something truly just out of love, it shouldn't be the only reward in itself, but it is a great reward. I will admit. And I think that's something amazing about Southern culture. Any other thoughts before we wrap up for today about the differences in the church and in the world. Any thoughts, comments, feelings about anything we've talked about?
I remember the first time I went to a foot washing.
Mm-hmm.
It was on a Maundy, Thursday, and it was in this room. I remember right where I was sitting, and I remember pairing up. We were asked to pair up with a friend in here, and I paired up with a friend who belonged to this church. And when I was washing her feet, she began to cry. And it was what you're talking about. It was that feeling of, it was not the feeling you have when you go down for a pedicure.
No.
It wasn't that deal. This was a very holy experience for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember her crying, and we talked about that. And she said, "This makes me feel odd, you know," and I said, "It's supposed to. I think this is my first time too." But it really affected us. And I think that's what you were trying to say, you know, that sometimes if you stop and listen and experience things, it can be revolutionary even when you're old.
Or young.
Or young.
My first foot washing experience was at my old church. I was probably 13, and we had what we all called the church mama. She just asked everybody to call her mama. She was the matriarch of her family. Like, her great grandkids went to that church. Like, it was several generations of her church. Her family were there at that church, and that was, and she's passed on now. But that was one of the most solidifying memories in my young life experience. She looked down at me and she said, "May you always serve like Christ as you have today." And she was just this tiny, small woman, and she was truly a prayer warrior. You know what I mean? And she gave that example. In my world, she was like 6 foot tall and bulletproof, but you know. But
Shasta, I think it's really interesting that your family is so female oriented and you have so much female influence in your life.
yeah.
I think that's unusual.
So my family is a weird one. My mom's side of the family, there's not been a boy born in the family in like 4 or 5 generations. And on my dad's side, I'm the first girl born in 4 or 5 generations. And so at my dad's family, I have to kind of fight for a seat at the table. They are not very affirming of me as a female pastor or a female minister. But
Female.
yes, but ironically, and pray for me, I get the opportunity. My family reunions are weird. We have a church service for a family reunion. We have a meal and a church service. And they have asked me to preach this year, mostly because I couldn't find anybody else to do it. But wins are wins.
Yeah, win.
Last year they couldn't find anybody else, and I had 15 minutes to prep a sermon. And I prepped it, and 22 people out of the family called and loved it, so they asked me to come again this year. So, but, you know, pray for that. But I thank you guys for coming alongside me today in this. It's been a few years since I've taught a Sunday school class. At my old church, I taught the high school kids as a high schooler. So I apologize if it was a little watered down, but that's kind of the teaching style I've been used to for so long. But thank you guys, and
Thank
you. You are free, butterflies, as my grandmother says.
So, we all remember that. The minister's daughter.